Tom Callahan's ranch stretched across the dry Arizona land like a lonely island in a sea of dust and sagebrush. For 10 long years, he had lived there all by himself, with no one to talk to except his animals. His wife Mary had passed away from fever years before, and his 2 grown children had moved far away to the bustling cities back east. Now it was just Tom, his old horse Dusty, and a small herd of cattle that needed constant tending. Every morning before sunrise, Tom would pull on his worn boots, sip bitter black coffee, and step out into the quiet world. The only sounds were the creaking windmill turning slowly in the breeze and the distant cries of coyotes at night. He worked from dawn till dusk mending fences, checking water troughs, and riding the boundaries of his land. The work never ended, but it kept his hands busy and his mind from dwelling too much on the silence. Sometimes in the evenings, Tom would sit on his porch and watch the sun sink behind the mountains, painting the sky in fiery colors. He'd scratch Dusty behind the ears and talk to him about the day's work, just to hear a human voice, even if it was his own. The horse would flick his ears as if listening, and that was enough company for Tom. He had grown used to the solitude, though the empty house still felt too big without Mary's laughter filling the rooms. Winter was coming, and Tom could feel it in the chill that crept into the evenings earlier each day. He had just finished storing the last of the hay in the barn when he noticed the first real cold wind blowing down from the north. That night, as he sat by the fire mending a bridle, he thought about how another long winter alone stretched before him. The snow would come soon, sealing him off from the distant town for weeks at a time. Then came the evening that changed everything. Tom was putting Dusty in the barn for the night when he heard an unfamiliar sound, the crunch of footsteps on gravel that weren't his own. He turned slowly, his hand drifting toward the rifle he always kept nearby. There at the edge of his yard stood a group of people wrapped in blankets against the cold. Their dark eyes watched him carefully as their leader, an older man with streaks of silver in his black hair, stepped forward. Tom's heart pounded as he realized these were Apache people, the very tribe some of his neighbors feared and spoke about in hushed tones. The man held up his empty hands in a peaceful gesture and spoke in careful English. "We ask for shelter, just for the night." Behind him, Tom could see women holding small children close, their faces tired from travel. The youngest, a little girl no bigger than as Mary had been at that age, peeked out from behind her mother's skirt with wide, curious eyes. For a long moment, Tom stood frozen, his mind racing. He knew some ranchers would slam the door without a second thought. But the cold wind bit at his own face, and he imagined how much worse it must be for those little ones. Without another word, he stepped aside and held his door open wider. The Apache families moved quietly into the warmth of his home, their moccasins making no sound on the wooden floor. That night, as Tom lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of other people in his house, he wondered what he had just gotten himself into. Little did he know this simple act of kindness would change his lonely life forever. Outside, the wind howled around the corners of the ranch house, carrying with it the promise of winter and the beginning of a friendship that would teach Tom more about life than 10 years of solitude ever had. The next morning, Tom would wake to find his guests already gone, leaving behind only neatly folded blankets and a small wooden horse carved from juniper-wood. But the memory of their quiet dignity and the little girl's shy smile would stay with him, making the ranch feel different somehow, as if the walls themselves remembered the warmth of other people at last. The knock came just as Tom was settling into his worn leather chair by the fire. At first, he thought the wind might have rattled the loose shutter by the kitchen window again. But then it came a second time, 3 firm raps that echoed through the quiet house. Dusty lifted his head from where he lay near the hearth, his ears twitching forward in curiosity. Tom's hand paused over the book he'd been trying to read. Visitors at this hour were unusual, especially with winter closing in. He stood slowly, the floorboards creaking under his boots as he made his way to the door. The firelight cast long shadows across the room as he reached for the iron latch. When he pulled open the heavy wooden door, the cold night air rushed in, making the fire flicker wildly. At first, Tom couldn't quite make sense of what he was seeing. His porch, usually empty except for his boots and the occasional sleeping cat, was filled with people. Men stood tall despite their obvious weariness. Women held children close to their bodies for warmth, and behind them all, the moonlight showed more figures waiting in the yard. Tom's breath caught in his throat as he realized these were Apache people. He counted quickly, 10 in all. Their clothes were patched and travel-worn, their moccasins dusty from long miles. The children's faces peeked out from beneath blankets wrapped tight around small shoulders. One little girl, maybe 6 years old, stared up at him with eyes so dark and serious they seemed much older than her years. An older man stepped forward. Silver streaked through his long black hair, and lines around his eyes spoke of many hard years. But when he spoke, his voice was calm and clear. "We ask for shelter," he said in careful English. "Just for the night." Tom's fingers tightened on the doorframe. All the stories he'd heard in town meetings rushed through his mind, tales of raids and stolen cattle, warnings never to trust the Apache people who still refused to stay on the reservation. Just last month, Sheriff Dawson had told everyone to keep their rifles loaded. But then the wind howled around the corner of the house, making the smallest child shiver violently. Tom saw the woman holding him pull her blanket tighter, but it was threadbare and full of holes. The oldest man, Chooli, Tom would later learn his name was, didn't flinch from the cold, but Tom noticed how his knuckles were white where he gripped his walking stick. Without realizing he'd made the decision, Tom found himself stepping back from the doorway. "Come in," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "It's cold out there." The Apache families moved quietly, their moccasins making no sound on the wooden floor. The children stayed close to their mothers, their wide eyes taking in the strange house with its odd furniture and hanging pots. Tom busied himself building up the fire, while the newcomers settled near the warmth. "Hungry?" Tom asked awkwardly, as the silence stretched. He moved to his pantry without waiting for an answer, pulling out bread, beans, and the last of his winter apples. The women accepted the food with quiet nods, immediately beginning to prepare it in ways Tom had never seen, crushing herbs between stones, toasting the bread lightly by the fire. As the smell of cooking filled the house, some of the tension eased. Tom noticed how the Apache men always positioned themselves between their families and the door, how they took only small portions of food for themselves to leave more for the children. One of the older boys, maybe 12, kept glancing at Tom's rifle leaning in the corner with a mixture of fear and fascination. Night fell completely outside, the wind still moaning around the eaves. Tom showed the women where they could spread blankets near the fire, while the men seemed content to sit upright against the walls, always watchful. The little girl who had stared at Tom earlier now sat closest to the hearth, her small hands outstretched to the flames. Tom found an extra quilt and brought it over. When he draped it around her shoulders, she looked up at him with those serious eyes and gave him the smallest smile. Her mother murmured something in their language that Tom couldn't understand, but the tone was clearly grateful. That night, as Tom lay in his bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a full house, soft voices speaking in another language, the rustle of blankets, a child's quiet cough, he wondered what his neighbors would say if they knew he had Apache families sleeping by his fire. But looking at the moonlight streaming through his window, he realized he didn't much care. Morning came too soon. Tom woke to find his guests already stirring, folding blankets with neat precision. The women had left his kitchen cleaner than they'd found it, and someone had even repaired the loose hinge on his cupboard door. Chooli stood waiting by the front door, as the others gathered their few belongings. "We go now," he said simply. "Thank you." Tom nodded, suddenly unsure what to say. The little girl from last night slipped past the adults and pressed something small into Tom's hand before darting back to her mother's side. When he opened his fingers, he found a tiny wooden horse, carved with such detail he could see every strand of its mane. Before he could properly thank them, the Apache families were gone, disappearing into the morning mist as quietly as they'd come. Tom stood in his doorway for a long time after, turning the little horse over in his hands. The ranch seemed quieter than ever now, but somehow different too, as if the walls had absorbed some of the warmth and life his visitors had brought with them. He placed the wooden horse on his windowsill, where the morning light caught its smooth curves. It looked right there, Tom thought, like it belonged. And though he didn't know it yet, this wouldn't be the last time Chooli and his people would cross his threshold. The winter ahead would be long and hard, but none of them would face it alone. The days passed quietly after the Apache's first visit. Tom found himself glancing at the little wooden horse on his windowsill more often than he'd care to admit. Each morning when he stepped outside to begin his chores, his eyes would automatically scan the horizon, though he told himself he wasn't looking for anything in particular. The ranch returned to its usual rhythm of work and silence, but something had changed in the air, a faint sense of expectation that hadn't been there before. Exactly 7 nights after their first visit, Tom was mending a saddle in the barn when Dusty suddenly lifted his head and whinnied softly. The sound was different from his usual greetings, more alert, more curious. Tom set down his tools and walked to the barn door, squinting into the gathering dusk. At first he saw nothing. Then movement near the far fence caught his eye. Shadows separated themselves from the landscape, resolving into familiar figures. Chooli led the group once again, but this time they carried bundles wrapped in animal skins and woven blankets. Their steps were slower, more purposeful than before. Tom wiped his greasy hands on his pants as he walked out to meet them. The evening air carried the scent of coming snow, sharp and clean. Chooli raised his hand in greeting, his face more lined with weariness than Tom remembered. "We meet again," Chooli said when Tom reached them. His English was careful but clear. Tom nodded, noticing how the children clung close to their mothers this time, their usual energy subdued. "Cold night to be traveling," he observed. Chooli's dark eyes held Tom's gaze. "We cannot travel much longer. Our winter grounds have been taken by the bluecoats." He used the Apache term for soldiers without bitterness, simply stating a fact. "The government says we must live on their reservation, but the land there is bad, no game, little water." One of the women spoke softly in their language, and Chooli nodded. "Winter comes early this year. We seek shelter until spring." Tom scratched his beard, considering. The old barn behind him stood empty except for some stored hay and tools. It was drafty but solid, with a good roof that didn't leak. He thought about Sheriff Dawson's warnings, about the notices posted in town offering rewards for information about renegade Indians. The little girl from before Tom had learned her name was Siki, meaning little bird, peeked out from behind her mother's skirt. Her cheeks were pink with cold, and she clutched the same worn blanket around her thin shoulders. Tom made his decision. "Barn's back there," he said, jerking his thumb over his shoulder. "It's not fancy, but it's dry. You can stay there through winter if you keep out of sight. Can't have folks knowing you're here." Chooli studied Tom's face for a long moment, then nodded once. "This we understand. We will not bring you trouble." That night, Tom brought extra blankets and an old pot for cooking to the barn. The Apache families had already begun transforming the space, sweeping the dirt floor, arranging stones for a small fire pit near the door where the smoke could escape unnoticed. The children watched Tom with curious eyes as he set down his offerings. As days turned into weeks, an unspoken routine developed. The Apache men rose before dawn to help with ranch chores Tom hadn't even realized needed, doing reinforcing weak fence posts, clearing brush that could hide predators, repairing the sagging roof on the chicken coop. They moved with quiet efficiency, leaving each task better than they found it. Tom learned that Chooli's son, Nantan, was a skilled hunter who could read animal tracks like most men read books. One morning, Nantan showed Tom where a mountain lion had passed near the north pasture, pointing out marks so faint Tom would have missed them completely. "See how the toes drag here?" Nantan said, crouching to trace the almost invisible line in the dust. "This means the cat is old. Move slowly now. Not dangerous like young ones." The women, led by Chooli's wife Dakia, began preparing meals that combined Tom's supplies with wild plants they gathered. Tom tasted stews flavored with herbs he'd walked past all his life without knowing were edible. Dakia showed him which leaves could ease a cough, which roots could help a wound heal clean. Siki and the other children gradually lost their shyness around Tom. They would giggle when he attempted to pronounce Apache words, then patiently repeat them until he got them almost right. Siki in particular took to following Tom around the ranch, her small feet kicking up puffs of dust as she struggled to match his long strides. One evening, Tom found her sitting cross-legged in the barn, carefully shaping a small figure from clay. "Making another horse?" he asked, remembering the wooden one she'd given him. Siki shook her head seriously. "This is Dusty," she said, holding up the lumpy but recognizable shape.
"For you.
"So you remember me when we go." Tom took the crude little sculpture gently. "You planning on leaving soon?" Siki shrugged, with the unconcern of a child. "Grandfather says when winter ends. But I like it here." She looked up at Tom with those dark, serious eyes. "Do you get lonely when we're not here?" The question startled Tom. He thought about the years of empty rooms and silent meals before these people had come into his life. "Yeah," he admitted. "I reckon I do." Siki nodded wisely, as if she'd known this all along. "That's why we came," she said simply, returning to her clay. "Grandfather saw your lonely smoke from far away." That night, as Tom lay in his bed listening to the faint sounds of life coming from the barn, a mother singing, the low murmur of conversation, the occasional laugh, he realized Siki was right. The ranch hadn't just become a hiding place for the Apaches. It had become a home for them all. The wooden horse still stood on his windowsill, but now it had company, a clumsy clay figure of Dusty beside it. Tom smiled in the darkness. Outside, the first real snow of winter began to fall, covering the land in a quiet blanket of white. For the first time in many years, Tom Callahan didn't dread the long months ahead. The morning started like any other. Tom was in the barn helping Nantan repair a broken harness when little Siki came running in, her bare feet kicking up dust. "Horses coming," she panted, her eyes wide. Many horses from the road. Tom and Nantan exchanged a look. No one ever came out this way, unless they had business. Tom wiped his hands on his pants and walked to the barn door, peering out toward the main road. A cloud of dust rose in the distance, growing larger as it approached. The rhythmic pounding of hooves carried clearly through the still morning air. "Sheriff's men," Tom muttered, recognizing the shapes emerging from the dust. Sheriff Dawson rode at the front, his silver star glinting in the sunlight. Behind him came 4 deputies, all armed with rifles slung across their saddles. Nanton's hand went instinctively to the knife at his belt. "We should run," he said quietly. Tom shook his head. "Too late for that. They'd see you in open country. Get everyone into the back stall and cover yourselves with hay. Stay quiet no matter what you hear." As Nanton slipped back into the shadows of the barn, Tom walked casually toward the house, trying to keep his steps slow despite the pounding of his heart. He reached the porch just as the sheriff's party rode into the yard. "Morning, Dawson," Tom called, leaning against a porch post like he hadn't a care in the world. "What brings you out this way?" Sheriff Dawson swung down from his horse with the ease of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the ranch yard before settling on Tom. "Heard some interesting news over in town," he said, hooking his thumbs in his gun belt. "Seems some Apaches slipped away from the reservation up north. Word is they might be heading this way." Tom kept his face carefully blank. "That's so." The sheriff took a step closer. "You seen any strangers around here lately, Tom? Any sign of Indians on your land?" Inside Tom's chest, his heart hammered so loud he was sure the lawmen could hear it. He thought of Chooli's quiet wisdom, of Dakia's healing hands, of little Siki's laughter as she played with the barn cats. "Ain't seen hide nor hair of any Apaches," Tom said, meeting the sheriff's gaze steadily. "Just me and my livestock out here, same as always." One of the deputies snorted. "We heard different, Callahan. Some folks say they've seen smoke from 2 chimneys over here lately." Tom forced a laugh. "That'd be my cooking attempts. Burnt 3 meals just this week." Sheriff Dawson didn't smile. He walked slowly around the yard, his boots kicking up little puffs of dust. Tom's mouth went dry as the lawman paused near the barn, studying the ground. Tom hadn't considered footprints the children played out here every day. "Mind if we take a look around?" Dawson asked, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. Tom swallowed hard. I do mind, actually. This is my property, and I don't take kindly to folks poking around without good cause. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. Tom could see the suspicion in Dawson's eyes, but also the hesitation. They'd known each other for years, had shared drinks at the saloon more than once. Finally, the sheriff sighed. All right, Tom. But if you do see any Apaches, you'd best let me know. They're dangerous, no matter how friendly they might seem. He turned and swung back onto his horse. We'll be checking all the ranches in the area. Can't have renegades stirring up trouble. Tom nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He watched as the lawmen turned their horses and rode back down the road, the dust clouds swallowing them up just as it had brought them. Only when they were completely out of sight did he allow himself to breathe again. That night, the Apache family stayed inside the barn, speaking in whispers. Tom brought them extra food from the house, his hands still shaking slightly from the close call. Chooli met him at the barn door. You took great risk today, the old man said quietly. The white law could have hurt you for hiding us. Tom set down the basket of food. Wouldn't be right to turn you in. You've done nothing wrong but try to keep your family safe. Chooli studied Tom's face for a long moment before nodding slowly. In my youth, I would not have trusted a white man who said such things. But you are different. You have shown us true hospitality. He placed a hand on Tom's shoulder. We will not forget this. As Tom walked back to the house under a sky full of stars, he realized something important. The Apaches weren't just guests on his ranch anymore. They weren't even just friends. Somehow, without him noticing, they had become family. In the days that followed, everyone was more careful. The children played inside the barn instead of outside. Cooking fires were kept small, the smoke disguised as much as possible. Tom found himself listening for horses on the road at all hours, his body tense with anticipation. But the sheriff didn't return. As winter deepened, the snow piled high around the ranch, creating a natural barrier that kept visitors away. Tom began to relax again, though he never completely let down his guard. One evening as he sat with Chooli by the small fire in the barn, sharing a pipe as had become their custom, the old Apache said something that surprised him. When spring comes, we must leave this place. Tom looked up sharply. Why? You're safe here. Chooli shook his head. Your kindness has been great, but we cannot bring more danger to your home. Already we have stayed too long. He puffed on the pipe thoughtfully. There are places in the high mountains where my people can live free. We will go there when the snow melts. Tom wanted to argue, to tell them they could stay as long as they liked. But he knew Chooli was right. The risk grew greater every day they remained. That night, as Tom lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he realized something surprising. The thought of the Apaches leaving made his chest ache. The little wooden horse and clay dusty on his windowsill seemed to watch him in the moonlight, silent reminders of how much his life had changed since that first cold night when strangers had knocked on his door. Outside, the wind howled around the corners of the house, carrying with it the promise that winter wouldn't last forever. And when spring came, everything would change again. The deepest winter months settled over the ranch like a thick wool blanket, covering everything in layers of pristine white snow. Mornings dawned so cold Tom could see his breath hanging in the air like tiny clouds as he trudged through knee-high drifts to feed the livestock. But where before these lonely winter days had stretched before him like an endless, empty road, now the ranch buzzed with quiet activity and warmth. Each morning began with the smell of cooking drifting from the barn. Dakia and the other Apache women had created a clever cooking area near the back wall where the smoke could escape through cracks without being noticeable. Tom would often find a warm clay bowl of Atola's sweet corn porridge waiting for him when he came to check on them, the steam rising in the frosty air. The children had fashioned sleds from old barrel staves and spent hours sliding down the gentle slope behind the barn, their laughter ringing across the snowy fields. Siki always made sure to bring Tom the best icicles she found, presenting them like precious gifts. They're magic, she told him seriously one day, holding up a particularly long, glittering spike. winter's fingers reaching down from the sky. As the days grew shorter, the evenings grew longer. After supper, Tom began joining the Apache men in the barn where they would sit around a small, carefully shielded fire. At first, the conversations were simple discussions about weather patterns, the health of the animals, repairs needed around the ranch. But as the weeks passed and trust deepened, the talks turned to stories. One particularly cold night, with the wind howling outside like a living thing, Chooli began telling of how the Apache people came to be. Long ago, he said, his voice low and rhythmic, the Creator gave our people this land between the four sacred mountains. We were taught to live with the earth, not against it. His hands moved gracefully as he spoke, painting pictures in the firelight. The deer gave us meat and clothing. The mesquite gave us food and medicine. The streams gave us life. Tom listened, mesmerized. He'd heard plenty of stories about savage Indians in town, but never anything like the stories of a people who knew every plant and animal by name, who could read the seasons and the flight of birds. Nantan showed Tom how to make snares from willow branches, their fingers working together in the firelight. This way, he murmured, guiding Tom's clumsy hands, the rabbit feels no pain. We take only what we need, and we thank its spirit. The women taught Tom which plants could be gathered even in winter, the inner bark of pine trees that could be ground into flour, the dried berries still clinging stubbornly to certain bushes. Dakia showed him how to prepare a tea from juniper needles that could ease a cough better than any medicine from town. Then came the great blizzard. It started one afternoon with fat, lazy flakes drifting down, but by nightfall the wind had risen to a shriek, and the snow fell so thickly Tom couldn't see the barn from his house. He fought his way through the storm with an armload of extra blankets, his face stinging from the icy pellets. Inside the barn, the Apache families had gathered close together, the smaller children tucked snugly between adults for warmth. Tom added his blankets to the pile and found himself pulled into the circle, Siki immediately curling up against his side like a contented kitten. For 3 days the storm raged, trapping them together in the dim barn. They told stories to pass the time, Chooli sharing tales of clever coyote, Tom recounting legends his Irish grandfather had told him about giants and fairies. The children listened with wide eyes, not caring where the stories came from, only that they were magical. Dakia taught everyone a game using smooth stones marked with symbols, laughing when Tom kept getting the rules wrong. The women sang songs in Apache, their voices blending in harmonies that seemed to warm the very air. Tom found himself humming along, picking up words here and there. On the second night, as the wind screamed outside, little Siki looked up at Tom and said, "Tell about when you were little, like me." So Tom found himself sharing memories he hadn't thought of in years about fishing with his father, about the time he'd tried to ride a calf and gotten thrown into a mud puddle, about his mother's apple pies that always burned just a little on the edges. The Apaches listened as intently as if he were telling the most exciting adventure story. When the storm finally passed, revealing a world transformed by towering snowdrifts, something between them had changed. Tom no longer saw Apaches when he looked at them, he saw Chooli, who could predict the weather by the way birds flew. He saw Nantan, whose hands could carve wood into living shapes. He saw Dakia, whose laughter could light up the darkest night. And Siki, who had somehow wiggled her way into his heart like the daughter he'd never had. As they all emerged blinking into the sunlight, the children immediately began building snow figures while the adults assessed the damage to the ranch. Tom realized something remarkable. For the first time in over a decade, he hadn't spent the storm days staring at the walls, counting the hours until he could be around people again. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for so long had quietly disappeared, replaced by something he'd almost forgotten: the warm, comforting feeling of belonging. As he helped dig out the chicken coop alongside Nantan, their breath making twin clouds in the crisp air, Tom understood that this winter would stay with him forever, no matter how many seasons came after. The snow around the ranch began to melt during the day, only to freeze again at night, creating a thin crust that crunched underfoot. With each passing week, the sun lingered a little longer in the sky. Spring was coming, and with it, changes none of them were ready to face. But for now, in the heart of winter, The ranch felt like its own little world, a place where an old cowboy and a band of Apaches had somehow, against all odds, become a family. First true day of spring arrived with a warmth that crept into bones chilled by winter. Tom stood in the ranch yard, watching as the last stubborn patches of snow surrendered to the sun. The air smelled different now, damp earth and green things pushing up through the soil, a promise they new life. Chooli found him there, staring at the distant mountains where the snow still clung to the highest peaks. The old Apache didn't speak at first, following Tom's gaze toward the horizon. When he finally broke the silence, his voice carried the weight of difficult decisions. "The time has come for us to leave this place." Tom's chest tightened, though he'd known this moment was coming. He turned to face Chooli, noting how the sunlight caught the silver strands in his friend's hair. "You could stay," he said, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "We've managed this long without getting caught." Chooli shook his head slowly, his dark eyes full of understanding. "The bluecoats will not stop searching. Every day we stay puts you in greater danger." He placed a weathered hand on Tom's shoulder. "And my people cannot live forever hiding in another man's barn. We must find our own way." That evening, the entire ranch gathered for a farewell feast. Dakia and the women prepared all of Tom's favorite dishes alongside traditional Apache foods. The smell of roasting meat and baking cornbread filled the barn, mixing with the scent of the special herbs Chooli had collected for the occasion. Siki sat close to Tom throughout the meal, her small fingers clutching his sleeve as if she could anchor him there. "I don't want to go," she whispered when the singing started. Tom swallowed hard, looking down at the top of her dark head. "I don't want you to go either, little bird." As the fire burned low, Chooli stood and presented Tom with a carefully wrapped bundle. Inside lay a beautiful hunting bow, its wood polished to a warm glow, the string woven from animal sinew. Alongside it rested a quiver of arrows fletched with hawk feathers. "This I made for you," Chooli said, his voice thick with emotion. "The wood is from the juniper that grows near your west pasture. The string comes from a deer you helped us hunt. The feathers—" He paused, smiling slightly. "The feathers were a gift from the sky, left by the hawk that watches over this land." Tom ran his fingers along the smooth wood, marveling at the care that had gone into its creation. "I don't know what to say." Chooli clasped his hand. "No words are needed. When you use this bow, remember our time together. Remember that different peoples can live as brothers." The children performed dances they'd been practicing in secret, their small feet stamping rhythms older than the ranch itself. Nantan played a flute carved from river cane, its haunting notes floating up through the barn's rafters. Tom found himself memorizing every face in the firelight, Dakia's quiet smile, Nantan's serious expression as he played, Siki's tear-filled eyes that refused to look away from him. Morning came too soon. The Apaches had packed sparingly, taking only what they could carry on their journey north to the high country where few white men ventured. Tom had filled their pouches with as much food as he could spare, dried meat, beans, flour. At the edge of the ranch, where the road disappeared into the hills, they all paused. Siki finally broke away from her mother and ran to Tom, throwing her small arms around his legs. He lifted her up, holding her tight as she buried her face in his neck. "You will come visit us," she demanded, her voice muffled against his shirt. Tom blinked back, the stinging in his eyes. "I will try, little bird." Chooli took Siki gently, settling her on his hip. "We will leave signs for you. Stacked stones by the creek, marks on the big cottonwood tree. If you ever need to find us, follow these." One by one, the Apache families came forward to clasp Tom's hand or touch his shoulder. Dakia pressed a small pouch into his palm, the herbs for his recurring back pain, he realized. Nantan nodded solemnly, the closest he came to showing emotion. Then they turned and walked away, their moccasins stirring little puffs of dust on the trail. Tom stood watching until the last figure disappeared over the rise, until even the sound of their footsteps faded into the morning bird song. The ranch yard seemed suddenly enormous in its emptiness. Tom wandered through the barn where the Apaches had lived, running his hand over the smooth walls of the stall Dakia had plastered with clay, the notches in the beam where the children had marked their growth. Back in his house, the silence pressed against his ears. The wooden horse and clay Dusty still stood on his windowsill, but now they were joined by Chooli's bow, its curve graceful against the morning light. Tom picked up the bow, testing its weight in his hands. Outside, a hawk circled high above the ranch, its piercing cry echoing across the land. Somewhere beyond the horizon, his friends were walking toward their future. And though his heart ached with their absence, Tom realized the loneliness that had once filled these rooms had been replaced by something else, memories that would never fade, and the quiet certainty that he hadn't just sheltered strangers that winter. He had found a family, and families, no matter how far apart they might be, never truly say goodbye. The days stretched long and golden after the Apaches left. Tom went through his usual chores, feeding the livestock, mending fences, checking the water troughs, but now every task felt different. The ranch that had once been too quiet now carried echoes in its silence. When he pumped water at the well, he remembered how Siki would giggle at the squeaky handle. When he walked past the big oak tree, he could still see Nantan showing him how to spot the best branches for carving. Tom kept Chooli's bow hanging above his fireplace, where he could see it every day. The smooth wood caught the morning light just so, reminding him of that last night around the fire. The little wooden horse and clay Dusty now had a special place on his kitchen table instead of being tucked away on the windowsill. Sometimes when Tom sat down to eat, he'd find himself setting out an extra plate out of habit before remembering no one was coming to share his meal. Spring deepened across the land. Wildflowers pushed up through the meadow, where the Apache children had played. Tom found himself noticing things he'd walked past for years without seeing. The way certain plants bloomed in sequence, how the birds nested in predictable places, where the best berries grew along the creek. These were things Chooli and his people had taught him without even trying. One afternoon, while checking fences in the north pasture, Tom spotted a strange arrangement of stones near the big cottonwood tree. 3 flat rocks stacked carefully one atop another, just like Chooli had described. His heart leaped as he crouched to examine them. The stones were placed deliberately, not randomly tumbled by weather or animals. Nearby, he found a faint mark carved into the tree's bark, an arrow pointing north. Tom ran his fingers over the carving, feeling the rough edges where the knife had bitten into the wood. It was fresh. They had left the sign for him. That night, he lay awake staring at the ceiling, imagining his friends making camp somewhere under these same stars. Were they safe? Had they found good hunting? Did Siki miss him as much as he missed her? As summer arrived with its blistering heat, Tom began making small changes around the ranch. He built a proper smokehouse like Nantan had shown him, far more efficient than his old method. He planted a medicinal garden with the herbs Dakia had taught him about: yarrow for wounds, mint for stomachaches, sage for cleansing. Sometimes neighbors would stop by and comment on these new additions, but Tom just shrugged and said he'd picked up some ideas. The 4th of July came, and with it the town celebration. Tom hadn't gone in years, but something made him saddle up Dusty and ride in. As he walked through the crowded streets, he overheard the same old talk about hostile Indians and trouble on the reservations. The words tasted bitter in his mouth now. When Sheriff Dawson started telling exaggerated stories about Indian attacks, Tom found himself speaking up without thinking. "Not all Apaches are like that," he said, his voice louder than he'd intended. The crowd turned to look at him. "Some just want to live peaceful lives, same as us." The sheriff's eyebrows shot up. "Since when did you become an expert on Apaches, Callahan?" Tom met his gaze steadily. "Since I got to know some." He left soon after, the stares of his neighbors burning into his back. Back at the ranch that night, Tom took down Chooli's bow and practiced in the fading light, just as Nantan had taught him. His shots still weren't nearly as accurate as his friends, but he was improving. As he retrieved his arrows from the hay bale target, a movement at the edge of the pasture caught his eye. A lone coyote stood watching him, its golden eyes reflecting the last sunlight. Tom froze. In all his years on the ranch, he'd never seen a coyote approach so close without fear. The animal studied him for a long moment, then turned and trotted away, pausing once to look back over its shoulder. Somewhere in the distance, another coyote called, and the creature disappeared into the twilight. Tom didn't know why, but the encounter left him feeling strangely comforted. That night he dreamed of running through sun-dappled forests with Nantan, of sitting by fires listening to Chooli stories, of holding Siki's small hand as they looked for animal tracks in the mud. When autumn's chill returned, bringing the first migrating birds overhead, Tom found himself watching their southward flight with new understanding. Like his Apache friends, these creatures followed ancient paths invisible to most eyes. They belonged to the land in a way settlers never could. The wooden horse on his table gathered dust, but Tom never wiped it away. That dust was part of the story now. Sometimes when the wind blew just right through the cottonwood trees, he would close his eyes and swear he heard faint laughter or the distant sound of a flute. Maybe it was just his imagination. Or maybe, in some way he couldn't explain, his friends were still with him. Tom Callahan still lived alone on his ranch. He still rose before dawn and worked until his muscles ached. He still talked to Dusty like the horse could understand him. But he wasn't the same man who had opened his door to strangers on that cold winter night. The Apaches had taken his loneliness with them when they left, and in its place they'd given him something far more precious, the knowledge that even in the quietest moments, he was never truly alone. As the first snowflakes of a new winter began to fall, dusting the ranch in familiar white, Tom stood on his porch and smiled. Somewhere out there, his family was watching this same snow, and that thought warmed him more than any fire ever could.